So, analog synths and analog synthesis, digital synths and digital synthesis. What's the difference? And more to the point, does it make any difference? Now, if you're quite happy with your knowledge of analog synths and digital synths and the various forms of synthesis, then that's fine. If you want to skip ahead, there is a set of timings in the description. Now, this video was prompted by a discussion I had with a friend of mine who's a musician, and everything he does is in the box. His entire studio, all his sounds and everything are in his computer. He does have a MIDI controller keyboard, but that's it. So we were having a chat about music and synthesizers, as you do, and he said, I'm getting some brilliant sounds out of and he mentioned an analog synthesizer. Now, I can't remember which one it was because we mentioned several different analog synths during the course of the conversation. But I said to him, oh wow, have you bought an analog synth? And he said, no, it's the one in the computer. So I said, well, that's actually technically a digital synth because it's coming from the computer and computer's digital. And a conversation ensued. It was a very friendly conversation and we discussed the pros and cons of digital and analog. Now, I will say more about this later on. But I thought if you were mainly on the computer, then the differences and nuances between analog and digital synthesis may be a little bit unclear. So this is why I'm making this video, hopefully to clarify things. Now, if you're a musician, I think these are the sort of things which you really need to know in any event, and they will be very useful in various aspects of making music. So before we look at the different types of synths and synthesis methods, let's just take a step back and see exactly what analog and digital mean. So I hate to throw dictionary definitions at you, but it's actually a reasonable place to start. So here is a definition of analog, particularly as it relates to electronic circuits. And it looks a little bit tacky, but the important thing to take away from this is that it is a continuously varying value. Now, that is the core of an analog system, and if that sounds a little bit techy, I will explain it in greater detail in just 1 second. Let's have a look at digital. Now, if anything, this is even more techy, but the bottom line and the takeaway from this is quite simply that digital uses a series of numbers. Now, at the heart of every computer, of anything that is got a computer chip in it that is digitally based, all the system is doing is running around a series of zeros and ones. A signal in a digital system is either on or it's off. It's a yes or a no. The switch is up or it's down. There are no half measures. So analog signals can vary continuously, whereas digital signals have to fit into an on or off measuring system. Now we'll see exactly how this translates into music examples. So here is a sine wave, and there are values on the chart here ranging from -1 at the bottom through 0 in the center to +1 at the top. Now, if this was an analog signal, this would have a value of 0, this would have a value of 1, the halfway point would have a value of 0.5, halfway between 0 and 0.5 would be 0.25, halfway between 0.25 and 5 would be 0.375. The point is that you can pick any point between any two values and that point itself will have a value. So hopefully this will make it clear. So we have 0.25 and 0.375. So if we move up a little bit, there will be a 0.255 and a 0.256 and a 0.257. Not only that, there will be a 0.2575 and a 0.2576 and a 2577. However close any 2 points are, there will always be another value you can measure in between because it continuously varies. And I don't want to use the word infinite. If there are any theoretical physicists or mathematicians in the house, there becomes a point when the fineness of this measuring system becomes irrelevant because we simply can't hear the difference. But the point is that this signal varies continuously throughout this curve. And there is no point you can point to and say, well, I haven't got a value here, because an analog signal, it varies continuously, and you will find a value at every single point. Now, this will become even more clear, believe it or not, when we look at a digital signal. So here is a digital attempt at capturing a sine wave. In order to do this digitally, what we do is to measure or sample, and using the word sample is an excellent way to think of this, because we do use sample rates in digital audio. So we would do this by sampling the sine wave at certain points. So you can see that in this example we have in fact sampled the sine wave. I haven't counted these, maybe, I don't know, 24 here, 24 there, maybe 50 times. This is one cycle. That's a half a cycle. This is the other half of the cycle. So this represents one cycle. So we've probably sampled it around 50 times during an entire cycle period. And it looks like a sine wave, doesn't it? Yes, it does. But if we look at the actual values we have, I shall stick a magnifier on here. So if we look at the actual values, we see that there's a value here and there's a value there, but there is nothing in between. Now, in an analog signal, there would be values all the way down, but in a digital signal, it jumps, it steps from one value to another. So it is not as accurate as an analog signal. Now, can we do anything about this? Yes, of course we can. We can use more sample positions, or we can increase the sample rate. What about this? There are a lot more samples here. So this looks far more like a sine wave than the previous example. But if we switch on the magnifier again, you can see that even though we have more samples, there are still steps in the signal. An analog signal would have a continuously variable set of values along this curve. Digital does not. So what can we do about it? Yes, we can take even more samples. Now this looks pretty good. This looks like a real solid sine wave. So how accurate is this? Well, let's get the magnifier on. And yes, it's pretty close, but there's still steps. So there are still values which are not represented digitally. Now, if there are some computer nerds watching this, and yes, I am a computer nerd, you will think, well, he's drawn this on a computer and the computer screen resolution is made up of pixels, so we're just seeing a pixelated image of a smooth curve. And that would be a valid point. But pixels themselves are digital, so it's either this point is either on one pixel or it's on another pixel. There are no half measures, and that is the total point. With digital, it's one thing or another. There are no halfway houses. Now, if I had drawn this on a piece of paper with a pen, that would have been a 100% analog signal, and this curve would be 100% smooth. Now, this begs the question, how often do you have to sample an audio source in order to accurately capture this sound? Now, we may tend to think of digital technology as being relatively new. The first digital synthesizers appeared in the early 1980s, and computer-based technology, which we use for recording and manipulating digital audio, didn't really start to take off until the 2000s. However, the theory behind this is not at all new, and 100 years ago, back in the 1920s, a clever scientist called Harry Nyquist determined that in order to accurately capture an audio signal, you had to sample it at twice the audio signal's frequency. Now, if that sounds a little bit complicated, I shall explain, and for that we have to look at Hertz. Now, I'm trying to be as non-techy as possible, but if you are using digital audio, you really must know about Hertz and frequencies, especially if you are going to EQ anything. So Hertz is used as a measurement of frequency, and 1 Hertz is 1 cycle per second. So if we use this sine wave as an example, this is 1 cycle here. So if this time period was 1 second, this sine wave would be vibrating at a frequency of 1 Hertz. Now 1 Hertz is far too low for us to hear. The lowest frequency we can hear is around 20 Hertz. Now this varies, the range of human hearing varies from individual to individual, and we lose a lot or some of our frequency range as we get older. But on average, the lowest frequency we can hear is around 20 Hertz, and the highest frequency we can hear is around 20,000 Hertz. Now 1,000 Hertz is normally abbreviated to kilohertz. So we'd say our range of human hearing is around 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. So according to Nyquist's theory, in order to accurately capture the entire range, the entire frequency range of human hearing, we would have to sample audio at 40 kilohertz. And if that is starting to ring a bit of a bell, you may recall that CDs are recorded at 44.1 kilohertz. Now some professional recording software records at even higher sample rates, such as 48, that's a standard pro recording resolution, and some even record higher than that, which increases the headroom and increases the amount of detail which you can work with when using digital audio. So by way of example, this is how to set the sample rate in Cubase. A lot of digital audio software has these settings and features hidden behind a set of nested menus, and this isn't too different either. So we go to project and project settings, and this will open a window, and you can see the sample rate is down on the bottom left hand side, and you click on the drop down menu and you get a list of the sample rates that you can select, and this goes all the way up to 192 kilohertz. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get a higher quality audio, because we can't hear a lot beyond our 20 kilohertz frequency range, but it does mean that you have more headroom to play with. If you are processing digital audio, then you can do this at higher rates without losing any of the audio quality. Of course, it also means that you will use up an awful lot more processing power at this rate. This fact that we need to sample at twice the rate of the source material's frequency is known as the Nyquist limit. And if you're working with digital audio, this is a term which you may well come across. So, that's digital and that's analog, and that is how they compare. So what is an analog synthesizer? Well, an analog synthesizer is one constructed from analog components, such as resistors and capacitors and diodes and transistors, all these lovely electronic gubbins, and this is how it generates its signals by passing electricity through all these components. Now, because these components are analog, and we'll get to digital in a second, because they are analog, they are not 100% accurate, and resistors and capacitors and these sort of electronic components normally have a tolerance factor. So the circuit designer might want a resistor of a certain value, but in practical terms they would get a resistor with a tolerance of perhaps 1 or 2%, or in some cases 5%, depending on how critical that value is. So when you put all these things together, all the components together, it's quite likely that two circuits which are designed to be the same will have very small variations in them, simply because of the tolerance values and the tolerance factors of the components used in their construction. Now, the electricity passing through these electronic components causes them to heat up, and this changes the rate at which the electricity passes through them. And many early electronic synthesizers were notorious for going out of tune, and you usually had to switch them on perhaps 15 minutes or half an hour or maybe even longer before performance in order to ensure that they were in tune for the performance. And even during a performance, it was not uncommon for early synthesizers to go out of tune. Now, if you buy a modern analog synthesizer, the instructions will often say switch it on for 10 minutes before you start playing to ensure that is warmed up and the tuning is stable. So digital synthesizers, well, these are just dedicated mini computers. They're still working with zeros and ones. All the calculations and the sound design are created by the chips. So it's either going to be an on or an off, a yes or a no. There should technically be no tuning problems, and this was a major plus, a major bonus for the early digital synthesizers. And this should also ensure that every digital synth sounded exactly the same. So that was fairly simple. Now what about analog synthesis and digital synthesis? Analog synthesis is obviously synthesis created by an analog synthesizer. Now in most cases we use the term analog synthesis when we actually mean subtractive synthesis. Now I am guilty as charged in this department, and one of my books, if I may be permitted, is the Quick Guide to Analog Synthesis, and what it talks about is subtractive synthesis. Now I'm not pushing the book, it's been out of print for ages. You might find an overpriced copy on Amazon. However, if you want to learn analog synthesis, I made a video on a free resource which is absolutely amazing. It's even better than my book. It's a lot longer than my book, but you get a lot more information and a lot more detail. A card should pop up there, and I will leave a link to the video in the description. So I wouldn't worry too much about semantics. Analog synthesis, subtractive synthesis, they are generally considered to be the same thing. However, for the sake of accuracy, we really ought to look at this a little bit closer, because analog synthesizers are not limited to producing just subtractive synthesis. Now in the early days of synthesis in the 1960s, Dr. Robert Moog, one of the fathers of synthesis, was producing analog synthesizers, and he used subtractive synthesis, and this is perhaps one reason why subtractive synthesis has become one of the mainstays of synthesizers. Now he was based in New York on the East Coast of America. However, on the West Coast, another father of synthesis called Don Buchla was also using analog circuitry to create synthesizers, but his approach was slightly different. So again, without getting too far into any detail, what subtractive synthesis does is to take a harmonically rich waveform and filter out some of the frequencies. So here we have a diagram of a harmonically rich sawtooth wave, and what subtractive synthesis does is to use filters to remove some of these harmonics. Now a low pass filter will let the low frequencies through and filter out the high ones. A high pass filter will remove the lower frequencies. But basically it starts with a harmonically rich waveform and then removes certain harmonics. And that is probably still the most popular form of synthesis today. And probably 90% of analog synthesizers use some form of subtractive synthesis. So that is why when we are talking about analog synthesis, most of the time people will realize that we are talking about subtractive synthesis. However, over on the West Coast of America around the same time, Don Buchla was also using analog circuitry, so he was making analog synthesizers, but his method of generating and shaping sound was slightly different. Instead of starting with a harmonically rich waveform and removing harmonics, one of his principles was to start with simple waveforms and to add them together. So this was a form of additive synthesis. And by doing this, the system created harmonically rich waveforms. Now, subtractive synthesis is often referred to as East Coast synthesis because it was developed and pioneered by Dr. Robert Moog on the East Coast of America. On the West Coast, Don Buchla was using his own form of synthesis, which, as well as additive synthesis, had also used wave shaping and a form of FM or frequency modulation synthesis. So both synths were analog, but they used different methods of synthesis to produce their sounds. So analog synthesis can do more than the one thing. So jumping over to digital synthesis, one of the first and possibly the first commercially available digital synthesizer was the famous and infamous Yamaha DX7. Now this used FM synthesis, frequency modulation, and it was totally different than anything anyone had seen before. It used a system of carrier signals and modulation signals in various combinations to produce its sound. Now the synth was famous for not having any controls, You had to dive so far into the menus to get anything out of it. You really needed breathing apparatus. Most musicians just didn't bother. They wanted to make music, but a few intrepid sound designers found out how it worked and came up with lots of patches which musicians could buy and use in their DX7. Now, FM frequency modulation is essentially just the process of modulating the frequency of one oscillator with another one. So technically, analog synthesizers can still perform FM synthesis. If you feed the output of one oscillator into the input of another one, that is FM synthesis. The Yamaha DX7 and its whole process took it several stages further. So that is one form of digital synthesis, but by no means the only one. Now, as you probably know, computers are pretty clever. They're pretty dumb, but they're very clever at the same time in that they can do many, many things. And various other forms of synthesis have been developed which are primarily the domain of the digital synthesizer. These include wavetable synthesis, granular synthesis, acoustic modeling. There are also other types of synthesis which digital technology can be used to produce. And of course, as we have seen, digital synthesizers can emulate analog synthesizers. And this brings us to our final question. Is there a difference? And if so, does it matter? Now, to some people this will not matter at all. They have probably switched off ages ago. I don't care, as long as I've got good sounds I can work with and make my music with, that is fine. And that is totally okay. So thank you for watching. But if you are interested in synthesizers, you can't fail but to have noticed that there has been a resurgence of interest in analog synthesizers over the past several years. So why is that? Since digital synthesizers can emulate analog synthesizers just as well. I know. But is that actually true? Now, analog aficionados would say absolutely not, because analog synthesizers, because of the very nature, because of the imperfections in their components, they have a sound all of their own. One of the things which the human ear likes about music are these little differences, these little imperfections. Now, whether you can actually hear and appreciate the difference in a genuine analog instrument as opposed to a digital recreation, that is up to you and your ears. But there are people who really like the sound of original analog equipment, and that is absolutely fine. But there is also one more important aspect to analog synthesis. And I think this is the most important part of this entire discussion, of this entire video. And that is the user interface. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, when Bob Moog and companies like Korg and Yamaha and ARP were designing synthesizers, they were all analog synthesizers. And because of the nature of their design and how they worked, they usually had one control per function. And this made operations so easy and so intuitive. You could look at the panel and you could generally see at a glance what controls did what. You can fiddle with them and adjust them and create new sounds. So they were very playable, very hands-on. And this type of interface has generally been passed on to modern analog instrument design. Now, digital synthesizers, on the other hand, because the possibilities afforded by a computer chip are almost limitless, they often have controls with many functions, and it is extremely common to have a shift button or a function button which you need to press and hold down while you press another button to activate a particular function. But more than that, most digital synthesizers have an LCD display. Now, these can be useful for several things: for naming patches, for example, or for setting up global settings which you are not going to change very often, such as MIDI channel inputs and outputs, or setting up a foot switch assignment. So the panel doesn't have to be cluttered with separate controls for things which you are not going to use very often. However, I have a theory. If you give a developer an LCD, they are going to make the most of it and cram as much stuff into it as they possibly can. So what this results in is what we now term menu diving, with menus and submenus and sub-menus and controls to change the various values of one thing or another. Now, on the one hand, this can give you access to the innards of a synthesizer which you would not otherwise be able to access. However, a lot of musicians, and obviously not everyone, think this detracts from the playability and the immediacy of the instrument. Now, this is highlighted, or perhaps we could use the term exacerbated, in modular modules, which are digital. Because of the small size of a module, in order to access many of the functions, you have to hold down a button or a combination of buttons, or you have to hold them down for a certain length of time, or hold them down and turn a knob or a dial, and the operation becomes far from intuitive. Now, if you have half a dozen of these modules which are all working in slightly different ways with different key press combinations, when you start to patch something, you might find you're running to the manual to check how to set up a particular function. Now, this obviously doesn't matter to a lot of people who are quite happy to sacrifice the playability and immediacy of the module for the power which they get through the various combinations of functions which it can produce. And this is the decision, of course, which only you can make. Now, I have analog synthesizers and digital synthesizers. I have a modular system which contains analog modules and digital modules. Now, although no one has specifically asked, if you do want to ask me which I prefer, well, I think all things in moderation. I saw a review of a digital module which came with a cheat sheet. Now, I can't remember what the module was. I think it was a very interesting, very powerful, and probably a very desirable module, but I thought if you have to have this beside you when you're operating the module, and this is just for one module, imagine having half a dozen cheat sheets. I thought, no, this is not for me. So I'm really tending towards the one knob per function approach, towards the immediacy and ease of use, the obviousness of the controls. But of course, some forms of synthesis you can only do digitally. So there are trade-offs, and I'm prepared to accept the little bit of multi-button pushing and hopefully a minimal use of menu diving in an LCD in order to get certain types of sounds. Now, if we go back to the situation which prompted this video in the first place, my friend with his in-the-box system. Now, until a year or so ago, I was also totally in the box. And it is fantastic because the range of sounds, the variety of sounds, and the control you have all of these sounds in software is absolutely phenomenal. But again, there is a little bit of a problem with the user interface, because to change most of the controls you need to use the mouse, and you only have one mouse, whereas with a piece of hardware you have two hands and you can quickly flip from one control to another if that's what you want to do. Now, having said that, most pieces of software have links to hardware. So Native Instruments Complete Control System, for example, links to their keyboard. I have an S49 keyboard, and if I pull up an instrument in Complete Control, many of the controls are automatically mapped to a series of encoders on the front of the keyboard. So it's not exactly the same as using a hardware synthesizer, but it is one of the trade-offs you have to make to get the variety and the power of using music software. Now, in a similar vein, Arturia's V collection, which is a collection of virtual instruments, they map to the Arturia keyboards. I have an Arturia Minilab Mark II, super little keyboard. It has a lot of rotary controllers and some drum pads. And when you bring up one of the V collection instruments, they are mapped automatically to the Minilab, which is wonderful. So I can get to play with a Moog modular system using rotary encoders and an ARP 2600 using rotary encoders. Now, it is far from the original experience, but it is as close as I think we can get at the moment. So, analog or digital, hardware or software, does it matter? Well, that is a question only you can answer. Personally, I do like hands-on control. I do like twiddling knobs and moving sliders. There's so much fun doing this when you're actually playing an instrument. But as I've said, analog or digital, the sound source and the sound generation doesn't matter so much to me as the user interface. So if you give me a digital synth with analog controls, I'd be quite happy. So what do you think? Do you have a preference for analog or digital, for hardware or software? What do you think of modern synthesizer interfaces? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Let me know in the comments. So I hope you found this interesting, informative and useful. Any of the above would make me very happy. In any event, I want to thank you for staying with me this far. If you have enjoyed the video, then please consider subscribing and ringing the bell and clicking the thumb. It really does help the channel, and I do, as always, really appreciate you taking your time to watch these videos. So for that, thank you very much indeed. I will see you in the next video.